Please welcome your panelists for How to Be a Man in 2018, moderated by Executive Vice President of the Milken Family Foundation, Richard Sandler.
So welcome, and before we get started, we have a little clip I'd like to show you to frame our discussion today. So please look at the screens. Yeah, you won't even get to see it. Perfect. How do you enjoy it so far?
The Industrial Revolution created new economic opportunities for families, while also reinforcing rigid gender roles by sending men to the workplace and leaving women behind to keep house and care for the children.
All I'm trying to say is that there are lots of things that a man can do, and in society's eyes, it's all hunky-dory. A woman does the same thing, the same, mind you, and she's an outcast.
Men benefited from, but were still restricted by those roles.
It says here, look, feed every 2 hours. Well, it takes me 2 hours to get her to eat anything.
While women who defied these stereotypes often faced inequality and hostility.
There is no protocol for a woman.
Okay, I get that part, Paul.
Young lady, you might not want to make waves, lest we have doubts about our decision to hire you.
Women of color faced additional challenges.
Let me ask you, if you were a white male, would you wish to be an engineer?
I wouldn't have to. I'd already be one.
The women's liberation movement of the 1960s redefined roles for men and women.
Lads do football or boxing or wrestling, not friggin' ballet.
As men continue to educate themselves about the challenges women face,
I am your employee, and as such, I expect to be treated equally, with a little dignity and a little respect.
And examine their own internalized conceptions of masculinity,
I'm Mr. Price's right arm. I'm not his typist.
we can all continue our march toward gender equality.
If the right honourable gentleman could perhaps attend more closely to what I am saying, rather than how I am saying it, he may receive a valuable education in spite of himself. That's all.
So the title of this panel, as well as our video, can elicit a smile or a little smirk here or there. But I can assure you that this is a very serious topic and one that should concern and does concern all of us. It's also a topic that fits perfectly within this conference's theme. We're navigating a world in transition. As we're going to explore over the next hour with our distinguished panelists, who I'll introduce in a second, unconscious biases and distorted definitions of what masculinity is and the role of a man versus a woman and other gender stereotypes needs to be understood, needs to be addressed, and needs to be overcome. A culture that prevents us from being more inclusive, healthy, and harmonious as a society not only goes against our values, but as we will learn during this panel, is also bad business. It's bad for the bottom line, and it's bad for our productivity. So our goal today is to let you learn to know what you do not know. And I don't believe there's any more valuable lesson for any of us in any field than to learn to know what we do not know. So I will quickly introduce our panelists. There's more longer descriptions in your material, and then we'll get started. So over here on my far right is Michael Ian Black. Michael's a multimedia talent. He starred in numerous films and television series. He's written and produced and directed films. He's an author and commentator and does stand-up. And he has spoken out and written on the subject of masculinity and how our culture defines various roles in a very unhealthy and unproductive way. Joanne Lippman is an author and former editor-in-chief of USA Today. She started her career at the Wall Street Journal, where she was for, I believe, over 20 years. She wrote this book, That's What She Said, What Men Need to Know and Women Need to Tell Them. She'll actually be signing the book after our panel here over in the right side here. Kevin O'Leary, I think a lot of you know Kevin. He's chairman of O-Shares Investments, as well as a television personality, best known as the Shark, on Shark Tank now for over 10 years. Kevin's also a regular contributor to ABC, CNBC, a best-selling author of a couple books, including Cold Hard Truth and Men, Women, and Money. And for those of you that just landed from another planet, on my far left is Alex Rodriguez. Alex is a 3-time MVP, a 14-time All-Star, a World Series champion with the New York Yankees, and Alex holds the record for the most Grand Slam home runs of any baseball player in history. Thank you. Alex also is the founder and the head of A-Rod Corp., which is involved in numerous businesses as an investor, including auto dealerships, fitness clubs, and real estate holdings. He's appeared with Kevin on Shark Tank. Hopefully they will be able to get along today, and is a regular on Fox, ESPN, Sunday Night Baseball. So let's get started. Michael, you saw in the clip the video of that man who was basically pleading with his son, do anything except ballet. You have a son, you have a daughter, and you've been quoted as saying that you didn't really feel comfortable in your own skin until you stopped trying to be a guy and started trying to be yourself. So what are your concerns about how masculinity is portrayed in our culture today? And tell us a little bit how you got to be interested in this topic.
I came to this topic through a kind of roundabout way, which is I live in the wilds of Connecticut in the town over from Sandy Hook. And when Sandy Hook happened, my kids were in elementary school a few miles away. And at that moment, I became kind of radicalized on the issue of guns and gun control. Through the years, I spent a lot of time paying attention to it, learning about it. And when Parkland happened, I made the connection, which is an obvious connection, which everybody in this room already knows, which is what these crimes have in common. South Park, Parkland, Toronto that just happened, and innumerable others, is they're all committed by boys and young men. And so the question is, why? What is it about masculinity, or the limits on masculinity, that is provoking these kinds of crimes? And so I started looking much deeper into the issue, and in particular, as you said, Richard, I come to it from the perspective of a parent. My son is now 17, and my worries for him have a lot to do with my worries for myself and how I was raised, and the way in which I find myself reacting in typically destructive masculine ways, which is to say, when confronted with problems, I find myself acting in the two most common social ways that men react, which is either withdrawal or rage. There isn't an emotional language for men to speak in a broader context than those two reactions. So I worry for him that I'm not giving him that language that he needs to succeed in the world, and that's why I'm committed to this work.
All right. So, Joanne, before I ask you the question, there are all of us men on this panel, and you. Are we part of the problem doing it this way, or just part of the solution?
Oh, I have got to tell you, I love this panel. I think this is great. I also love looking out at this audience and seeing so many men. I mean, that is the reason I wrote That's What She Said, is because there are so many issues that women face at work and in life. And we talk about these issues amongst ourselves all the time. Things like being marginalized, overlooked, not taken seriously, not heard, in addition to being underpaid and the other issues that we know about. But women talking to each other, which we do all the time, it's half a conversation. And I feel very strongly that it gets us at best to half a solution. And the only way we're going to solve the gender gap is to bring men into the conversation. So I'm delighted to actually be with you gentlemen and with all the men in the audience.
So we saw in the clip from Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn For those of you that have no idea what those names mean, that was a little black and white clip at the beginning of the video. That's from a movie that is 70 years old. Have we come as far as some would make us think we have come since that clip?
Yeah, I mean, that is the sad thing. When you look at that clip, actually it's so accurate even today. And that is one of the things you mentioned earlier, unconscious bias. And there are unconscious biases that have prevented us from really making the progress that we need to do. Unconscious bias are those biases we have buried deep inside of us that we don't even know they exist. Women have them as well as men have them. But all of the things, the little elements we saw in that little film clip, they still exist. Just as a for instance, the research shows, and the research I did for That's What She Said, shows that women are interrupted 3 times more frequently than men. Northwestern University actually studied the Supreme Court of the United States and found that the female Supreme Court justices are interrupted 3 times more frequently than the male Supreme Court justices. So it doesn't even matter how far up you go. And it's the same thing. When women are in the minority in a room, they literally aren't heard. Your ear is attuned to the male voice in the room. So I think every woman in this room probably has had that experience where you say something and it's crickets. It's like nobody heard it. And then 2 minutes later, some guy repeats exactly what you just said, right? And a show of hands among the ladies here. Because I will tell you statistically, it's about 100%. It happens to all women. And then everybody turns to the guy and they say, hey, Dave, great idea you had.
So how did you get interested in this topic from being involved in the Wall Street Journal and USA Today?
Sure. So I spent 2 decades at the Wall Street Journal. I was surrounded by men. I was writing primarily about men. My colleagues were men. My mentors were all male. My sources were primarily men. And I had a great experience with these men. And yet, you would then go with my female friends and colleagues, and when we all got together, we talked about all of these issues that were so common to women, and I really felt like there was a disconnect. It's great for women talking to each other, and it feels good, and when I speak with groups of just women, it's like a warm bath of love. It's awesome. But it's half a conversation. It's just not, we really need, and I think there are a lot of great men out there who really would be our allies if only we invited them in and we let them know what some of these issues are. We all need to work together to close the gap.
Okay, so speaking of great men, we have Mr. Wonderful. So Kevin, you have owned businesses, you sold businesses, you obviously are an investor today. You've changed your investment strategy from investing in companies run by men to investing in companies run by women. Tell us a little bit about your background, how you got involved investing, and why you went from one strategy to another.
So when I was young, I had a rather seminal event occur to me. My dad died very young. He was 36. My mother remarried to a graduate at Champaign, Urbana, and we all moved there. And he went into the United Nations right out of his PhD. And from that day on, I lived in different countries every 24 months. We started in Cambodia, Tunisia, Ethiopia, Cyprus, all the Asian countries, and all through Europe. And a lot of those cultures, particularly the Asian ones, people don't realize don't work the same way as North America. There's a very strong dominance of women in running not only business, but families. And when you're 7 years old, I didn't know it at the time, but that was really interesting to be exposed to that, because it's made me a way better investor today. I mean, I took advantage of things going on in Cambodia after the turmoil there, because I understood how that culture worked. And when the French moved in to do real estate and the German developers, I was there with them because I understood how big that could become. But my point is that you can't understand these cultures unless you live in them. You can read anything you want, but you've got to live there and be there at night and see how it works. And it kind of changed my mind forever about, thinking in how to invest in countries, but also who runs businesses. And my interest in being on this panel is very simple. In the beginning of I had a big liquidity event in the late 90s when I sold the learning company to Mattel. It was a $4.2 billion transaction, and many entrepreneurs get that first. I had nothing before then because I couldn't afford pizza at my wedding, and I'm still with that same wife, so she was pretty impressed. And I said, look, this now takes me into a different journey, and I started investing. And the first decade of investing, I did what everybody else did. I just invested in companies run by men because I never thought about outcomes. And then as the decades rolled on, I looked at my portfolio recently. This is a big revelation for me 2 years ago. PwC, my auditor, said to me, look, we're going to start doing going concern tests in December across all the companies you have control in, because if it looks like they'll go bankrupt during the next 12 months, we can take that right off in December, which is what happens in venture investing. That's nothing unusual. So we started doing the work. So you can imagine how this hit me. Not some of my returns, this is across 34 portfolio positions. All of them came from companies run by women. And I just wasn't seeing it. And I said, wait a second, what the hell is going on here? What are they doing? The average size of the company, the smallest is 5 million, the biggest is $500 million. 28 people, the average size, all small cap, all private. So this is a pretty risky portfolio, and there's a lot of volatility in it. And so when we did the research, and what I did with this is I commissioned the research to figure it out, then I got all the companies to South Beach this February. We took over the Betsy Hotel, and I said, guys, we got to understand what these women are doing, because I'm making a lot of money over on this side, and I'm getting nothing from you guys. So let's talk, because these portfolio companies are in their 7th and 8th year in some cases. Here's what we discovered. Time management skills. You know that adage? If you want something done, give it to a busy mother. In a company with 28 people, the woman running it allocates time extremely efficiently, not only her own, but that of her employees, number one. But here's the killer. Here's the secret sauce. We went back and looked at every quarter of sales estimates for 7 years in every company. The companies run by men only hit their sales targets 65% of the time. Who cares? We called that the testosterone target, because it was very high and it wasn't met very often. And then on the women-run businesses, 95% of the time, they hit their sales targets. Who would care? Why would that matter? Here's how it manifests itself in IRR. In a company where goals are met consistently, quarter after quarter, the culture changes. It becomes very sticky. People want to stay in winning teams. It's almost a baseball analogy. You want to be on a winning team all the time. There is no staff turnover, virtually zero. So you didn't lose your head of accounting, or the woman or man running sales, or the head of logistics. And that manifested itself in huge cash returns. So now I say, look, if I'm a 51% shareholder in this thing, I want sales targets that you hit, which means you bring them down up to 35%, and the culture starts to change. This is how they did it. This is best practice. So now I'm kind of agnostic. I would give money to a goat if I could get a return. But I'm looking at it saying, when I'm looked at an opportunity to invest in a CEO that's a woman versus a guy, my experience in small cap has been the money goes to the women, just because it's the path of least resistance. And I don't think I'm the only person that's figured this out. You're starting to see this manifest itself in measuring returns and risk profiles all over financial services companies. It just hasn't manifested itself into the averages of salaries yet, but it's coming. I'm extremely optimistic. In society, things change when it's about the money. That's what I find. You can have a great cause, but if it doesn't have any economics driving it, you could flounder for decades. This is about returns of money, and you know how that motivates people. People say one thing, but when you talk about money, it's a whole different deal. And I think that's why, if you're a woman today, you should be extremely optimistic based on performance alone.
Great. So, Alex, you're probably in many ways a symbol of what Michael is concerned about, okay? For those that don't know you, they see you as a world-class athlete, star in American pastime, but in a business, it's certainly dominated by men all through the business. Yet at the same time, you've had strong women in your family and in your life, including starting with your mother. Today, A-Rod is, as I said, a multifaceted business. But tell us a little bit about your background, how you kind of look at these issues of masculinity and how it affects investing and your companies, and really when you started investing. This isn't something that you've just come to recently. Please.
Yeah, thank you. So, born in New York, raised in Miami, and single mother. My mother had 2 jobs growing up. I was a beneficiary of the Boys and Girls Club. That's where I learned how to play baseball. And it was a place from 3 to 5 that I would just go there. Oh. 6 or 5? So I learned how to play baseball. Am I good here? Okay. Thank you. Learned how to play baseball at the Boys and Girls Club, and really just became such a big part of my life, the Boys and Girls Club. And I remember after my mother would finish work, she would come home on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday with her pouch, and that's where she kept her tip money. She was a secretary in the morning, and she served tables at night. And I remember Monday, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays, I would take her pouch out, and I would count her money, 21, 22, 23, 24. And I said, Mom, great night. But by Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, it would be 58, 59, 60. I thought we were as rich as Warren Buffett. It was wonderful. And I remember around 10 years old, I had two dreams. One was I wanted to be a Major League Baseball player. Back then, we had only WOR and cable, so the Mets was my favorite team, believe it or not. And then I wanted to be a businessman. I wanted to go to B school and be a CEO or CEO of some major private or public company. And it was around the same time when I was 10 where my father left and never came back. And it was around that time that I promised myself. I remember thinking, almost going down to my knees, I said I had two prayers. One was, I'm going to promise that when I have kids, if I have kids, I'm going to be a present father, an encouraging father, and be there for my kids. And the other thing is, I want to go out and invest in properties because we never earned anything. We never owned anything. So I always thought that, boy, this rent would come every 3 or 4 days. It felt like, and I saw the pain in my mother having to come up with rent money and I said, boy, if I can ever one day switch places with the landlord and not be the tenant, I'm going to do that. So around 22, 23 years old, I bought my first apartment, which was a small duplex. And the reason I did that, if you think about sports, it's very different than everybody in this room. Average career in Major League Baseball is 5.5 years. You make about 90% of your money from age 20 to 30. And less than 5% of the 750 players today in Major League Baseball, less than 5% have a college degree. Now, I'm not a stockbroker, but with that information alone, I was short that stock. Okay. And that's the reason why I started investing.
And what role do women play in your organization today?
They play a huge role. I mean, first of all, whether I've had always big influences in my life that are women. Obviously, starting with my mother, which I talked about. I have two daughters, 13 and 10, Natasha and Ella. And, Jennifer's a pretty strong woman in my life as well. But when you think about my organization is really led by women. My chief of staff, my managing director who's here today, my CFO, all women. And when I hired these women, I didn't hire them because they were women. I hired them because they were the best talent. And I've always said talent is talent, and so is character.
Great. So it's sort of current and topical that just last Saturday in the business section of the New York Times, there was an article called "At Nike, Revolt Led by Women Leads to Exodus of Male Executives." And some of the actions complained of by the women at Nike were blunted career paths, women feeling marginalized in meetings, passed over for promotion, an environment that favored male voices and lack of female leadership. Now, this is a company that is the top company in its field. It's one of the great companies in America today. If you go on their website, they are promoting 25 women athletes that have contracts with Nike. So, Joanne, what happened there? Are you surprised? And what is there in our culture that allows this to happen?
Yeah, first of all, I'm not surprised, and it's not that I'm not surprised about Nike. I think that this story is incredibly consequential because it is being repeated in companies across the country. And, the things I was talking about earlier that women talk about amongst ourselves are exactly the list that you just read. And I think that's enormously important. If you think about the Me Too movement. The Me Too movement exploded back in October after the Harvey Weinstein allegations, but the reason that it exploded is not because every woman has been sexually assaulted at work. It's very important for us to understand that, right? That's not the reason it exploded. The reason it gathered so much steam is because every woman does know what it feels like to be marginalized and passed over, and all of the things that the women at Nike are talking about. They're not talking about getting physically assaulted. They're talking about the things that happen to you 100 times a day, every day, that create the culture of a company. So I would not be surprised if we see more of those sorts of stories coming across. My hope is that by publicizing it, that we finally will start to see some culture change. And I would add that you know, in my reporting for That's What She Said, I was actually seeking out, I crisscrossed the country and the world, seeking out primarily male leaders to tell the stories of male leaders who are trying to promote culture change and trying to close the gap. So I am optimistic that by exposing that kind of culture, we'll start to come up with the tools to fix it.
So Michael, you talked about your own children. So when you see articles like this and what's going on, other than the other issues that drove you to this in the first place, what do you tell your son? What do you tell your daughter? And is it the same message or is it a different message?
When parenting, I think there's a couple things to keep in mind. First of all, I think everybody with kids knows, the first and best thing you can do as a parent is to model behavior. Kids don't want to hear what you do, they want to see who you are. And that modeling is incredibly important. For a man to speak to his son or to be around his son means to express his full self as a human being, not his narrow, culturally defined self as a man. So that's one element of it, and it's the most important element. However, after that moment when your son is seeing you or daughter, but because we're talking about boys, model your behavior, the next thing that happens is they go into the next circle of their lives, which is their peer group. And that peer group has a profoundly impactful, it's profoundly impactful for your kid, because the way they see their peers behaving, if it does not comport with the way they see you behaving, they will follow their peers' example. The third ring around this is the larger culture, the way men are portrayed in the media, and the way the culture at work, the culture at large exists. We see it in the workspace, but we see it in a kind of generalized sense as well. It's those three circles that I worry about as a father. I can control one of them, which is my intimate relationship with my son and with my daughter. But this conversation about masculinity has to greatly expand beyond these one-on-one interactions, which is why I'm so glad this conversation is happening here today and that the turnout is so good. Because men, I think, intuitively understand that they are closed off from their essential humanity within the constructs of masculinity as it exists.
So, Alex, you used to be involved with Nike. So you see that. You have two daughters also. And you're back in the baseball business, at least with respect to your advising, I think, Mr. Steinbrenner's son, and you're doing Sunday night baseball with a very talented woman announcer. Do you encourage your kids, your daughters, to get involved in athletics, in the business? Can women take positions in the baseball business?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, if you turn on every Sunday night at 8:05, you hear a three-person booth. In the middle, my colleague sits Jessica Mendoza. For those of you who don't know who Jessica is, she's a Stanford grad, one of the greatest softball players of all time, and she represented the United States and won a gold medal. And she had to work a lot harder to earn that seat than I did, and that shouldn't be the case. But when you think about, one thing that I've always thought about is there's 30 teams out there. Baseball's been around more than 100 years. I still cannot believe that from the 30 teams, you've never, ever, ever had a woman GM to lead a team, general manager. And I often think to myself, well, if I look at the resumes of the 30 GMs, generally, most of them didn't get past the Little League. So what right do they have? What qualifications do they have to tell me or someone like me what to do versus a Jessica Mendoza? So it's my hope that Jessica's already broken glass, but continues to do, and perhaps Jessica could be the first general manager and is making the world a better place for my daughters.
Oh, great. So Nike has said, Kevin, that they are now going to invest more in their human resources. They're going to do a comprehensive review, and they're going to make management training mandatory. I know you're chomping at the bit. We'll get to there in a second. But is that really going to make a difference in a company? Are you going to invest in a company because they're doing better management training and sensitivity training?
That's the knee-jerk reaction of crisis management. I'm a shareholder in Nike. Like every other shareholder, I don't like news like this for pragmatic reasons. This hurts the brand. This kind of thing hurts the perception consumers, men and women consumers, have about the company. And in a way, the outcome will be positive. You may not like the knee-jerk reaction in the beginning, but look at it this way. The other S&P companies, the other 499 companies, all their boards saw that news and went, you know exactly what they said to themselves. and so by calling this out and by going through the heart attack of what happened there, the culture of boards changes two ways. One is they want to be more inclusive of not just gender but race, obviously, because that's a calling card. And we have a very, you can really give the credit to all of this to social media. When a story breaks, and I watch the desk at CNBC, I work there 3 days a week, I really enjoy that work. But when a story breaks, you can watch in seconds which ones are going to go through the 24 to 48 hour cycle, because the board lights up. And you know the poo-poo has just hit the fan. And that story was a poo-poo hitting fan story. And we knew right away that this was going to start to affect, market cap, all kinds of comments from all kinds of pundits on both sides of this issue. And we were waiting for more information. But the point is, as a result of that, you know damn well that the culture inside that company, whether it has to be pulled out like an infected intestine, it's going to get fixed. And that's a good thing. And also, I ask myself, like every other investor, why wouldn't you put performance above everything else? Why wouldn't you say, why would you care who gets the role as long as they're the best person to get the highest returns with the path of least resistance? And in that case, it's going to be a woman 50% of the time. Every time. But you can see how a company like Nike might have had an old boys culture from its rapid geometric growth from the early days, and that maybe some of that tenure ended up in certain parts of the company, but it is finished now, and now it's under they're like an ant under a microscope or a magnifying glass with the sun on them. You know that every day people are going to be saying, what have you changed? And you can be critical about how fast that's going to change, but it goes way beyond Nike. This is good news for every S&P and mid-cap Russell 2000 company. When I invest in companies now, I ask this question: how many women do you have running anything in here? Number one. Number two, who's on your board? And I'm just one investor. You can imagine institutional or sovereign wealth fund is making damn sure they don't get exposed in a situation like this, because it taints everybody. I like this stuff, and I like what social media is doing, because it's shining the transparency onto these situations in incredible speed. The Nike story stayed in the press for 36 hours, which is today a very long time. And now you're bringing it back. You're stirring up the,
Well, they're not a sponsor here, so.
No, I get But it has a long lingering effect, and now we're going to talk about how ineffective it is to announce you're doing HR stuff and all that. But at least they're doing something, and to me that's always the first step. But boy, are investors ever watching. Nobody wants this in their portfolio. Nobody needs these headaches. Nobody wants to be tainted with this brush when there's no reason. There's no. You can't tell me out of 100 men that I shouldn't have 50 women there running something. Because I've lived it. You want the best performance, period. And that's going to be 50% of the time a woman. So I think this issue is going to resolve itself pretty damn quickly, because you can't make this mistake again in a large cap company.
Okay, so you heard from Alex about Jennifer Mendoza, who he thinks should be the first GM in baseball. Just being an announcer on Sunday Night Baseball, she has broken through a glass ceiling in doing that. How many people here know who Tammy Jo Schultz is? Okay, a couple. Tammy Jo Schultz is the pilot of Southwest Airlines who saved hundreds of lives 2 or 3 weeks ago. She's a former fighter pilot who did a phenomenal job, apparently with no instrumentation to help her. She is one of about 6% of all commercial pilots who are women. Every time I get in an airplane and my wife hears a woman's voice from the cockpit, she relaxes. She said, I know what this woman had to go through to get here. I feel much more comfortable. The other day, the New York Times had a statistic that there are just as many Fortune 500 CEOs named John as there are Fortune 500 CEOs who are women. 3% of the population is named John. Over 50% of the population is women. So we can go back to the sensitivity training, but how does really this happen? What are men taught? What are women taught that causes this? And how do we change these statistics? If you were advising Nike, what would you advise them? Because they're obviously, seriously, a brilliant company with a lot of brilliant management.
Yeah, we could talk about diversity training in a second, but to go back to why are there so few women, it goes right back to what Alex was talking about with the resumes. You're looking at resumes and saying, wait, why this person and not that person? Well, there's a reason for that, and it is this unconscious bias. There was actually research done on this that where, and you guys have probably even heard about this, where there's been several sets of research where they use the same resume with a man's woman and a man's name and a woman's name. And in every case, the man gets the job more often and is offered more money than the woman if she is offered the job. So there's this unconscious bias. Then if they do get the job at every level, women are 15% less likely to be promoted than a man. There is actually—
Did you say 15 or 50?
15% at every level. And it does start really, really early. It doesn't start in the workplace. It doesn't even start in school. It starts at home very early on. There's research that shows that mothers of infants routinely overestimate the crawling ability of their sons while they underestimate the crawling ability of their daughters. Parents of 2-year-olds who type into Google, "Is my child a genius?" more than twice as likely to type that in about a boy 2-year-old as a girl 2-year-old. And then in elementary school, there was a test done where students were given a math test and their names were taken off. The tests are graded. The girls outscored the boys. Then their names are put back on. They're scored again. The boys outscore the girls once the names are put back on the papers. So there is this unconscious bias that that by the time you get to college, a female college student needs to have an A average to be seen as the equal of a male student with a B average. And by the time you get to the workplace, there is research that suggests that a woman needs to be 2.5 times more competent than a man to be seen as his equal. So again, it starts young, and by the time we even get to the workplace, we have internalized, all of us, women as well as men, this concept that women are worth less and that therefore our contributions are not as valued as those of men. And diversity training, I'll just say very quickly, diversity training doesn't work. This Nike thing, I'm sorry. Here's the deal. So there was a Harvard professor who looked at 30 years of diversity training at more than 700 companies, and he found that for women as well as for black men and women, it actually made things worse. And there were a variety of reasons for that, but one of the major reasons was resentment on the part of the men, primarily white men, who were being forced to take this, who saw it as punishment, right? And so a lot of companies now are trying to replacing old-fashioned diversity training with unconscious bias training, because the idea is we all have biases. It's guilt-free, right? We all have biases, so none of us are at fault, so therefore we can all be in this together. I don't have a problem per se with the training, but I think the big issue is exactly what Nike says, which we're going to fix the HR department. Their problem is not the HR department. The problem is the management. You have to have your CEO and your CFO own the importance of diversity, because they have to understand it's a business imperative. And this is what Kevin was touching on, this idea that there's a ton of research out there that shows you that more women in leadership makes you more financially successful. There's reams of research, and it all comes to the same conclusion. Adding women to work groups makes them more creative. They can even solve a murder case more accurately. I mean, there's all sorts of research that shows you that. And so therefore, you need the CEO and your chief financial officers to own this as a business imperative rather than offloading it to your HR department.
Yeah. So, Michael, in the things you're thinking about, the work you're doing, studies you're doing, why is it that men are reluctant to step up in the workplace and defend women?
I'd like to broaden out that question because I think it's an important question, but it speaks to larger issues with masculinity. Women have, Joanne, what I think you were saying is really important about the way these things start very early. And we can say definitively they really start at birth or sometimes pre-birth when gender is identified. When the baby is born, the first thing the doctor says is it's a boy or it's a girl. Well, there's cascading flowcharts that emerge from that very moment. And one of the great benefits of being a female in this culture is having the benefit of learning emotional intelligence, cooperation, creativity, I think, is sort of more widely accepted in girls, particularly as they get older. And women, because of traditionally their lesser status in the culture, have to seek out help, or I shouldn't say have to seek out help, are more conditioned to seek out help and are more willing to accept help and to work with cooperation, in cooperation. Those things translate directly to how well people succeed in the workplace and in life in general. For men, we are conditioned from a very young age to be closed off, self-protective, and assert that we can do things on our own. We know just individually, we need help. But the very words, can you help me with this, to come out of a man, in effect, reduce his masculinity, because masculinity is about power. It is about the projection of power and the projection of strength. That projection is false, and it's killing us. It's literally killing us in very measurable ways. Suicide rates, addiction rates, life expectancy for men is going down in a lot of cases. A lot of it can be directly attributable, that's the word, to being so closed off, so unable to say, can I have some help? And that certainly happens in the workplace, and I think it's one of the reasons that women may be better managers. They have a better language. They have a better language of cooperation, creativity, and emotional intelligence.
So on this topic of how men look at themselves, let me ask you, Alex, and then I'm going to open it up for questions so you can be thinking about what you want to ask. You're an athlete. You were on an athletic team for many, many years, and today you actually work with athletes that retire to help them get going again. How do athletes, since we assume that athletes represent this masculine image that society has given them, how do they view themselves, and how do they view, when they get involved in investments, their relationship with women?
For many years, I spent the last 25 years in a major league clubhouse, and that's good and bad. And with those 25 years, I only won one championship. And the reason why is because it's really, really hard to win in sports and in business and in life. And what I've learned is that it really takes an army to win. In 2009, from the Ushers to George Steinbrenner, for whatever reason, for 8 months, we had it all right. We stayed healthy. We were in the right frame of mind. We call it what is called the zone. And that was very important. But our roster was so diverse in talent, in age, in passion. And it was a magical thing. When you're a part of that, it's so special. I think one of the problems, if you think about over the course of time, men have been appraised by blood sports. Men get appraised by, do we win at war? Do we win at sports? What's your net worth? You often don't hear, this guy built a great company because he built a great culture, or because he believes in equality, or because he believes and pushes and advocates diversity. And that's a problem. If you think about some of the greatest organizations and businesses ever built, it's about curating great talent to put them together. By the way, Mark Zuckerberg wouldn't be Mark Zuckerberg without Sheryl Sandberg doing tremendous work as a COO. You know, Warren Buffett wouldn't be Warren without Charlie Munger. And Alibaba, if you look at Jack Ma, he wouldn't be Jack Ma without Joe Tsai, right? So even you have a counterpart. You have a Robin. So it takes curating of great people. I always tell young players this, to come back to your questions about athletes. Athletes, and I had this conversation with you a couple weeks ago, is I think athletes have the ability to be some of the greatest business people in the world because they're tough. They get their butts kicked. If you think about baseball, if you succeed 30% of the time, you go to Cooperstown. What's in Cooperstown? The Hall of Fame. So what else does it sound like? 8 out of every 10 companies fail as a starter. So when you're in sports, you're used to running into that wall, getting knocked out, getting into that wall, getting back up, and that's really important.
Yeah. So now I'm going to open up to see if any of you have questions. This is not the time to pitch your business to Kevin. This is time to see questions for this panelist on what is really a very serious topic. So any questions, if anybody out there? Who, you see somebody raising their, yes, back over here.
So can you address the issue that keeps coming up? It's the Tony Robbins question. I'd love for this panel to take on that issue of the men right now who are backing away from mentoring women or from taking them on business trips or hiring them, saying, my answer to sort of Time's Up and Me Too right now is, I'm not going to put myself in that situation. If you all could address that.
So Kevin, maybe Joanne, you guys want to take a shot at that?
That is probably one of the downsides to the Me Too movement. Certainly, executives are hypersensitive about being put in a situation where there is no third party to adjudicate a situation that could develop. And I think that's the probably unintended negative consequence, because the mentoring process in business between men and women in either direction is very important. And I would say that in either direction, because you can have a situation where a woman CEO would be concerned about, being alone in an office with a young intern that's a male. I think it's the same thing, but that's the pendulum having swung in that direction. Probably corporate culture will adjust. But again, I go back to, in the end, the reason long-term change occurs is because there's powerful economic forces at play. And what I'm trying to make a point about here is what's happening very quickly, and it being accelerated by the pressure of social media, by the scrutiny and the transparency it provides, is that ultimately, if we go 10 years from now and we look at, because I don't really focus on boards as much as I do management. It's my personal belief, when you're an investor, I really couldn't give a beep about who's on the board. I care about who's deciding the marketing strategy and who's doing the operations and the manufacturing logistics. Those jobs actually affect outcomes way more than all the old crusty hacks sitting on the board that want $250 a year. I don't care about them. I want to see managers that know what they're doing, and that's just a personal opinion. And I would rather see dramatic change in the mid-management and upper management of companies towards performance metrics. And if that happened, the outcome would be that you would have 50% of the time women running it, because they're just as good, in some cases better in certain jobs, as I've shown. I mean, I look at, this is not academic research, I'm talking about real cash flow here. That matters. That's how investors react. So I'm extremely optimistic that even though through the downside of that issue, that it's worth to go through the pain to get to the other side of this, to make the economy better, companies better, the country more competitive. We got to get ourselves to 3.5% GDP growth here. We got to compete with Asia. Otherwise, in the next 20 years, most of the capital flows will be out of our economy. How do we do that? We get great managers running companies. We get great people starting companies, and 50% of the time, that should be women. So I'm not worried that this isn't going to resolve itself in a beautiful way. Why? Because of money. That's why.
I would actually say that I do not have a lot of patience for guys who say that, who say, oh, can't talk to a woman. I think it's an excuse. We are at a delicate moment. We are sort of readjusting sort of how we all work with one another. But for you guys out there, I got to tell you, the vast majority of women in this world are not looking at you as a potential sexual predator. It's just not the case, right? So, and I would say there's actually never been a better time for men and women to be able to engage in this conversation because it is out there on the table that this is no longer just a girl thing. This is not a girl issue. This is an all of us issue, and we all need to solve it together. So I think it's actually a good time to engage in the conversation. And the one thing I'd say to women, by the way, when I do talk to women about this, is women also need to, we can own up to our own biases. We need to be open as well, because one of the, there was, even before Me Too, there was a survey done of executive men that asked them what would make you stand in the way of being a champion for equality in the workplace. And 74% of the men cited fear. And part of their fear is that they'll say the wrong thing and we women will bite your heads off. So women can do our part as well to make sure this is an inclusive conversation.
And I'll pick up on that one last point because you and I talked about this earlier. Where does crying come into the equation?
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you asked about that. So in researching That's What She Said, one of the things that I as I said, I sought out successful leaders, male leaders, to talk with them about what they were doing to close the gap. But the first question I would ask them is, what perplexes you about your female colleagues? And what shocked me was the number one thing that I heard from these men was, I'm afraid she'll cry. Now, what's fascinating about that, there's a whole lot of research that goes on behind that, is it goes into this disconnect between how men and women relate to one another. For instance, men are able to read the expressions of other men by their faces. They cannot read the expressions of women by their faces. And the theory is this goes back to caveman days where the men were out hunting and gathering, and they had to know immediately if they saw another man if he was a friend or an enemy, whereas they apparently didn't have to know about the lady back in the cave. But another really, I think, important piece of this in this miscommunication is that the men who I spoke with, they're primarily in leadership, and they're saying, I'm afraid she's going to cry. I'm afraid I'm hurting her feelings. So guys, when a woman cries in the office, he thinks he did something to hurt her feelings. But that is completely wrong. What women will tell you is that when women cry in the office, it's not because their feelings are hurt, it's because they are pissed off. They're frustrated and they're angry. And a woman crying in the office is exactly the same thing as a man yelling in the office. But there is this miscommunication.
I see my assistant shaking her head at me. So I'm a little concerned. Yes, over here. This question. Somebody will bring a. Here you go.
Hi. I wanted to ask about. I'm curious to know your thoughts on men's dynamics and interactions with one another. Me Too clearly highlighted a lot of the toxic interactions between genders in the workplace, but men do a lot of really shitty stuff to each other as well. There's a lot of those dynamics exist of aggression. And I'm curious to know what kind of conversations are happening between men among how they treat one another, and what conversations you think should be happening.
Okay. Can I look at answer this
go ahead.
For a moment? I think it's a great question, and the answer is those conversations aren't happening. They've never happened, and they need to happen. One of the lessons of the last 50 years with feminism is women found a way to speak to each other about how they are viewed by each other and by the culture at large in terms of being women. And women, because of their frustrations, were able and open to have that conversation. That concurrent conversation has never happened with men. So as women have expanded who they can be in the culture, men have reacted in two ways. One, they have felt threatened, And two, they have not been able to recognize that that same conversation needs to happen we need to have that conversation with each other. Every guy that I know operates from a place, masculinity is defined from a place of power, as I said earlier, and the language of masculinity is the language of power. The reason we can't have that conversation is because to admit your vulnerability is to weaken your own place of power in the culture. We have to expand the definition of masculinity so that it includes your full human self in the way that women have redefined their selves in the culture to include their full humanity.
So I'll take one more question, and then I'm going to have a closing question for our panelists. But since we've had no men ask questions, this gentleman right up here.
And I wanted to ask you, Alex, I'm a huge fan. My son's a huge fan, has a poster by his bed. But he's asked me a couple of times about the steroids story and what happened there. And, and I've had to talk to him about it. And it's, men make mistakes. People make mistakes, and they have to own up to them. And I think one issue in kind of the toxic masculinity thing and how to be a man is that there is this stigma around ever admitting that you're wrong, that you did something wrong or you have a weakness. And I think it's in our political culture now, this idea that you just never admit error, you just push ahead. And you had a very different experience. I mean, you owned up to that in a very public way and talked about some of the reasons that you felt pressure to do it and that it was the wrong thing to do. I wonder if you just talk about that experience a little bit, what that was like for you to speak about that publicly and have to admit that you did something that was wrong and these are the reasons that you did it, and how more men could kind of own up to stuff that they screwed up.
Yeah, thank you. One thing that was by far the most challenging part of my life, and it was one of the biggest mistakes I've made in my entire life. And I learned so much through the process. And I think in 5 or 10 or 15 years, I'm going to be able to look back and say that was the best thing that happened in my life because of the lessons that I learned. And, I served a year suspension. And what I learned in that process was that while I wanted the suspension to be shorter, the entire year was actually a good thing because, I'm in the construction business and real estate business, and sometimes you can rehab a house, or in this case, I needed to knock the entire house down and start one step at a time, one brick at a time. And I needed to turn the lens inward and realize, why am I continuing to make these mistakes? And I needed to, the whole year, to figure that out and do the work. And then I had to go out and call a lot of people, make a lot of uncomfortable calls, people that stood by me, bankers, investors. And I thought that those calls would take 3 weeks. It took 3 months to build the courage to make those calls. And to this day, all of them are still my partners. They're still my banks. They're still my investors. And they told me that calling at the darkest hour was one of the most impressive things I've done, even including baseball. And when I think about the lesson I learned is when you own up to your mistakes and you say, I'm sorry, it is amazing how forgiving the American people can be. And when I came back, I had one goal. I was 40 years old. I had 2 hip surgeries, 2 knee surgeries. I hadn't played baseball in a year and a half. I was a pariah. The Daily News said that they had a poll, and I think 2% of the people thought I would make the team. Well, as a 40-year-old, I was able to come back with a simple goal. I want to make the team. I hope I have a good spring training so I can get the 747 off the ground, beat up 747. And I just want to enjoy every day and appreciate being one of 750, appreciate being a New York Yankee. And I went on to have probably my best year with 33 home runs and leading the Yankees back to the playoffs. And it was the arc, yeah. And I think just the arc of my career, having my best 2 years as a 19-year-old and as a 40-year-old, at least told me all I had to know, and realizing that mistake, A, wasn't necessary, and B, hopefully kids like yours, kids like mine, can learn from my mistakes and pivot and do much better things in their life. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Right there. So we're towards the end of the session, so I'm going to ask each of the panelists to just let us know what's the one thing they want you to leave with today. We'll start with you, Kevin.
So I'm very optimistic about the outcome. The very fact that we're having this panel discussion and all these people are here and that we shine the light of transparency on this issue is all good. And I look at it, obviously, through the lens of an investor. And I'm very encouraged that performance and economics will drive this change pretty well better than anything else, because that's just the way the world works, and I'm an optimist on this outcome. 10 years from now, massive change.
Thank you. Michael?
I think Alex just hit it on the head. I think what I would want anybody to take away from here today is courage, particularly men. And the courage that I would implore you to have is the courage of compassion. And the compassion has to be to yourself as a man, to recognize that you are a vulnerable, full human being. And then the compassion to deal with other men and women in a way that you don't see them as opponents, but you see them as people that you can work with and cooperate with to make the culture itself more inclusive, in the hopes that this issue won't be an issue or will be less of an issue 20, 30, 40 years from now. This is generational stuff that we're talking about, but it has to start now, and it has to start with courage.
Alex?
I would say I'm still recovering from that question. I would say don't fall into being biased, right? Because, again, the fact that better-looking people, and this is a study I just learned of, better-looking people, male people, get into B school better than short people or people that are overweight or even women. And to me, that's mind-blowing. So as a leader, everybody in this organization, I mean, we are really literally in a bubble. The 1% here at the Milken is we have a responsibility not to break through that. Continue to build great teams, continue to build diversity, not just because you need it or because it's social impact and you want to be good, because it is really the best thing for your organization. Continue to build that platform for others.
Okay, thank you, Alex. And I could say unequivocally, you're a class act, and you are exactly the kind of athlete that I want my children to look up to. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So, Joanne, who will be signing her book in a few minutes.
Yeah, I would hope that the audience here and all of us would take away what we've heard today and share it with others. Because I do think, we are very fortunate that we're all in this room together. And I think the overwhelming message is that, we are all in this together, men and women. Women have been leaning in like crazy, but we can't do it on our own, nor can men do it by themselves. We all need each other. We need to understand that this gender gap is something that impacts us all. It's not a female issue. It's an all of us issue, and we can all work together to close it. And I remain optimistic that we're on our way.
And I am not paid to do this, but there is tremendous information about what we should be thinking about, why we are where we are, and how we get to the next level here. So let me close, first of all, by thanking all of you. I want to thank our men and women in the military, who I see at every one of our sessions. Thank you for all you do. And I want to thank our panelists. I think this was a great session. I appreciate that. And I hope we've all learned something. And when we come back here next year, we will be farther than we are today. So thank everybody. Thank you.